Imagine a continent with almost no roads. No railroads. No highways. No bridges stretching across wide rivers. Instead, imagine thousands of miles of forests, lakes, marshes, rapids, and winding waterways reaching deep into the heart of North America. Now imagine that every piece of trade, every message, every bundle of valuable goods, and much of what Europeans knew about the interior of the continent depended upon men in wooden canoes. These men were called voyageurs. For more than 2 centuries, they paddled across enormous distances through some of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. They connected distant settlements, carried the wealth of the fur trade, helped map vast regions, and became an essential part of the story of North America. Tonight, we will follow their journey. We will travel from the crowded docks of Montreal to the remote forests beyond Lake Superior. We will explore the rivers that served as highways, the companies that built trading empires, and the indigenous nations whose knowledge made these journeys possible. And as the world around them changed, we will see how the voyageurs helped shape an entire continent. To understand the voyageurs, we must first understand the world they lived in. Today, it is easy to look at a map of North America and see clear borders, highways, cities, and rail lines. In the 17th century, however, much of the continent appeared very different. European settlements were concentrated near coastlines and major rivers. Beyond those settlements stretched enormous regions that Europeans knew only in fragments. Maps often contained blank spaces. Distances were uncertain. Mountain ranges were poorly understood. Many rivers remained unexplored by Europeans. Yet these lands were far from empty. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had lived across North America. They had developed extensive knowledge of rivers, lakes, forests, seasons, and trade routes. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, indigenous nations maintained networks of exchange that connected communities across vast distances. Goods moved from one region to another. Ideas traveled alongside them. Information about distant peoples and places spread through these networks. Waterways played a central role in this world. North America contains some of the largest freshwater systems on Earth. The Great Lakes alone form an immense inland sea. Countless rivers connect lakes to one another, and eventually flow toward the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, or the Pacific Ocean. For travelers moving through forests that lacked roads, waterways offered the most practical routes. A canoe could carry people and cargo much more efficiently than travel on foot. Even when rivers became impassable due to rapids or waterfalls, travelers could carry their canoes and supplies over land before returning to the water. This process became known as a portage. The voyageurs would eventually become masters of portaging. But the practice itself had deep indigenous roots. When French explorers first arrived in northeastern North America, they quickly recognized the importance of indigenous transportation methods. Among the most remarkable technologies they encountered was the birch bark canoe. Lightweight yet surprisingly durable, these canoes could travel through narrow streams, cross large lakes, and be carried across portages. Compared with European boats of the period, they were perfectly suited to the environment. The future of the voyageurs depended upon this technology. The story of the voyageurs is closely connected to the story of New France. New France was the name given to France's colonial possessions in North America. Beginning in the early 17th century, French settlements developed along the St. Lawrence River. One of the most important settlements was Quebec, founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608. Champlain is often remembered as an explorer, mapmaker, and founder. But he was also deeply interested in trade. Trade provided the economic foundation that made colonization possible. And among all trade goods in New France, one product became especially important: the beaver pelt. At first glance, this may seem surprising. Today, beavers are often associated with rivers, dams, and wildlife conservation. In early modern Europe, however, beaver fur had enormous economic value. The underfur of the beaver could be processed into felt. This felt was highly prized for making hats. For centuries, fashionable hats served as important markers of status and identity in Europe. Demand for quality felt hats remained strong. As European beaver populations declined, merchants increasingly looked to North America as a source of supply. The forests and waterways of North America contained vast numbers of beavers. For French merchants and colonial officials, the fur trade represented a tremendous opportunity. But there was a challenge. The animals were located far inland. The fur had to be collected, transported, and delivered across enormous distances. No roads existed to make this easy. The solution emerged through cooperation between French traders and indigenous communities. Indigenous hunters supplied many of the pelts. European goods such as metal tools, cloth, firearms, kettles, and other manufactured items moved in the opposite direction. Between these worlds stood the transportation network. And at the center of that network would eventually stand the voyageurs. The word voyageur comes from the French language. It simply means traveler. Over time, however, the term acquired a more specific meaning. A voyageur became a professional canoe man. He was hired to transport trade goods and furs along established routes. His work demanded strength, endurance, skill, and experience. The distances involved were extraordinary. A single journey could require months of travel. A crew might paddle from dawn until evening. They would cross lakes that seemed as vast as oceans. They would carry heavy cargo over steep portage trails. They would battle insects, storms, cold temperatures, and exhaustion. Yet generation after generation continued to undertake these journeys. The rewards were not usually great wealth. Most voyageurs earned modest wages. What drew many of them was opportunity. For young men living in rural communities along the St. Lawrence River, voyageur work offered employment, adventure, and a chance to see lands few Europeans had ever visited. As the 17th century progressed, the fur trade expanded deeper into the interior. Each year, increasing quantities of goods moved westward. Each year, increasing quantities of fur returned eastward. The need for skilled canoe crews continued to grow. Without realizing it, these early travelers were helping create one of the most remarkable transportation systems in history. A system that stretched across forests, rivers, and lakes for thousands of miles. A system that would eventually reach the Great Lakes, the Northern Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and beyond. In the next part of our journey, we will step into that watery world itself and explore the vast network of rivers and lakes that made the age of the voyageurs possible. Before we continue deeper into the story, if you enjoy long, relaxing history documentaries like this one, please consider subscribing to Sleepy America. And if this video is helping you unwind, a quick like is always appreciated. Now, let's continue our journey into the world of the voyageurs. To understand how the voyageurs lived and worked, it helps to forget, for a moment, the modern map of North America. Today, a traveler can cross thousands of miles by highway, railway, or airplane. Distances that once required months can now be covered in hours. Cities are connected by networks of roads. Supplies move in trucks and trains. Communication travels instantly. The voyageurs lived in a different world. For them, water was the primary route through the continent. A river was not an obstacle. It was a road. A lake was not a barrier. It was a highway. The geography of North America shaped nearly every aspect of the fur trade. In many ways, the success of the voyageurs depended less on technology than on understanding the natural landscape. The eastern half of the continent contains one of the largest freshwater systems on Earth. The Great Lakes alone hold roughly one-fifth of the world's surface fresh water. Lake Superior, the largest of them, stretches so far that early travelers often compared it to an inland sea. Storms on Superior could be as dangerous as storms on the Atlantic Ocean. Yet the Great Lakes were only one part of a much larger network. Thousands of rivers flowed into them. Other rivers connected distant watersheds. Some streams were navigable only during certain seasons. Others changed dramatically depending on rainfall and snow melt. To travel successfully, a voyageur needed to understand this living geography. He had to know where currents were strongest. He had to know where rapids became dangerous. He had to know when water levels were rising or falling. He had to know where a canoe could pass and where it could not. Much of this knowledge had been accumulated by indigenous peoples over countless generations. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous nations had established extensive transportation routes throughout the continent. These routes connected hunting grounds, fishing areas, villages, ceremonial centers, and trading locations. Travelers moved goods across astonishing distances. Copper from the Great Lakes region reached distant communities. Marine shells from coastal areas traveled far inland. Stones suitable for tools could be found hundreds of miles from its original source. The existence of these trade networks revealed something important. North America was not a collection of isolated communities. It was a connected world. The connections simply followed rivers, lakes, and portage trails rather than roads. When French traders entered this environment, they depended heavily upon indigenous guides and trading partners. Many early European explorers survived only because indigenous communities shared geographical knowledge. They learned where rivers flowed. They learned which routes connected one watershed to another. They learned where dangerous rapids could be avoided. Without this knowledge, expansion into the interior would have been far slower and far more difficult. One of the most important technologies in this world was the birch bark canoe. To European observers, these canoes often seemed remarkable. They were light enough to carry over land, yet strong enough to transport heavy cargo through wilderness regions. The construction process required considerable skill. Sheets of birch bark formed the outer covering. Wooden frames provided structure. Roots, often from spruce trees, were used for sewing sections together. Natural resins helped seal seams against water. The result was a vessel perfectly adapted to the environment. European boats were often heavier and less practical for inland travel. A birch bark canoe could move through narrow streams, cross lakes, and survive long journeys that would challenge many larger craft. Different regions produced different styles. Some canoes were designed for speed. Others were designed for carrying large cargo loads. The largest freight canoes used in the fur trade could carry several tons of goods. When loaded, they sat low in the water and required experienced crews to handle safely. Despite their strength, they remained surprisingly fragile. A collision with sharp rocks could damage the bark. Improper loading could create dangerous instability. Constant maintenance was necessary. Voyageurs learned how to repair canoes quickly because a damaged canoe far from assistance could threaten an entire expedition. The canoe was only part of the transportation system. The other crucial element was the portage. The word portage comes from a French term meaning to carry. Whenever a waterfall, rapid, or other obstacle blocked navigation, travelers left the water and carried their equipment overland. Sometimes a portage lasted only a few hundred yards. Sometimes it stretched for miles. For voyageurs, portages became among the most demanding parts of the journey. Trade goods were packed into large bundles. These bundles often weighed around 90 pounds. Strong men sometimes carried 2 bundles at once. That meant transporting loads approaching 180 pounds across rough terrain. The canoe itself also had to be carried. Large freight canoes could weigh hundreds of pounds. The work was exhausting. Portage trails often crossed rocky hills, muddy ground, tangled roots, and dense forests. Mosquitoes and black flies added to the misery during warmer months. Yet these trails formed critical links in the transportation network. A route was not defined only by rivers. It was defined by rivers connected by portages. In effect, every successful voyageur needed to become both a paddler and a pack carrier. The rhythm of travel reflected this reality. A crew might paddle for hours, reach a rapid, unload the canoe, carry cargo across a portage, return for additional loads, relaunch the canoe, and continue onward. Then they might repeat the process several times in the same day. The physical demands were extraordinary. But over time, voyageurs developed techniques that increased efficiency. Experienced crews worked with impressive coordination. Each man understood his responsibilities. Cargo was organized carefully. Time was valuable because the trading season was limited. Winter brought ice. Spring floods created hazards. Autumn storms threatened travel on large lakes. Every journey depended on making progress before conditions changed. As the fur trade expanded during the 17th century, certain routes became especially important. The St. Lawrence River served as the Great Eastern Gateway into the interior. From there, travelers moved toward the Great Lakes. Beyond the Great Lakes lay additional rivers leading deeper into the continent. Each route functioned like part of a vast transportation web. To modern eyes, the system can seem almost unbelievable. Thousands of miles of trade depended largely on human muscle. No engines powered the canoes. No machines carried the cargo. The movement of goods relied on paddles, endurance, skill, and intimate knowledge of the landscape. Yet this system worked remarkably well. For generations, it carried the economic lifeblood of New France, and later much of the northern fur trade. And as demand for fur continued to grow in Europe, increasing numbers of young men found themselves drawn into this demanding profession. Soon, the waterways of North America would become crowded with crews heading westward, carrying trade goods into the wilderness and returning eastward with cargo that connected remote forests to markets across the Atlantic Ocean. By the late 17th century, a curious connection linked the forests of North America to the streets of Paris, London, and Amsterdam. A beaver swimming through a quiet pond in the wilderness of Canada could eventually influence the fashion choices of wealthy Europeans thousands of miles away. This connection formed the foundation of the fur trade. And the fur trade, in turn, created the world of the voyageurs. To understand why so many men spent their lives paddling across a continent, we must first understand why beaver fur became so valuable. In early modern Europe, clothing carried social meaning. The materials people wore often reflected their wealth, status, and occupation. Among the most important accessories of the period was the hat. For gentlemen, merchants, military officers, government officials, and members of the upper classes, hats were more than protection from weather. They were symbols of respectability. The problem was that fashionable hats required high-quality felt. Felt is a dense material created by compressing and interlocking fibers. Not all animal fur produces the same quality felt. Beaver underfur proved especially effective. It created a durable, water-resistant material that could be shaped into elegant hats. As European demand increased, beaver populations in many regions of Europe declined significantly. Hunters had trapped beavers for centuries. In some areas, the animals became scarce. Merchants therefore began looking elsewhere. North America offered an answer. The continent possessed vast wetlands, rivers, lakes, and forests that provided ideal habitat for beavers. For European traders, these regions appeared to contain almost limitless opportunities. Yet valuable resources alone do not create an economy. Resources must be collected. They must be transported. They must reach markets. This required cooperation among many different groups. Indigenous hunters played a central role. Across large portions of North America, indigenous communities possessed extensive knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal migration patterns, trapping methods, and local environments. Their expertise made the fur trade possible. European traders did not simply enter the interior and gather furs independently. In most regions, they relied upon trade relationships with indigenous nations. These relationships involved negotiation, diplomacy, mutual interests, and sometimes conflict. Different indigenous nations approached trade in different ways. Some saw opportunities to acquire useful goods. Others sought strategic alliances. Many recognized that European trade goods could alter regional balances of power. Metal tools offered advantages over stone tools. Iron kettles simplified cooking. Firearms changed hunting and warfare. Cloth provided alternatives to traditional materials. As trade expanded, both Europeans and indigenous communities adapted to changing circumstances. The fur trade was never a one-sided process. It was a complex system involving multiple peoples pursuing their own goals. French colonial officials understood the economic importance of this trade. Unlike some other European colonies, New France did not initially attract large populations of settlers. The colony remained relatively small compared with the English colonies developing farther south. Population growth was slow. Resources were limited. Colonial leaders therefore focused on activities capable of generating wealth despite a modest population. The fur trade became one of the most important answers. Furs could be exported to Europe and sold for significant profits. As long as trade routes remained open, the colony could support itself economically. This reality encouraged exploration. Merchants wanted access to new sources of fur. Colonial officials wanted to strengthen French influence in the interior. Missionaries sought opportunities to spread Christianity among indigenous communities. Each group had different objectives. Yet all required transportation. And transportation required men capable of moving goods through the wilderness. At first, many traders traveled independently. Some became known as coureurs de bois, a French term often translated as runners of the woods. These men ventured deep into the interior, sometimes beyond the direct supervision of colonial authorities. They traded with indigenous communities and often spent long periods away from established settlements. The coureurs de bois became famous in later stories and legends. They were often portrayed as adventurous frontiersmen living beyond the boundaries of colonial society. The reality was more complicated. Some were successful. Others struggled. Colonial officials sometimes viewed them with suspicion because independent traders were difficult to regulate and tax. Authorities preferred a more organized system. Over time, efforts emerged to control trade more effectively. Licenses were introduced. Trading networks became increasingly structured. Large commercial enterprises gradually expanded their influence. As this process unfolded, a distinction emerged between traders and transport workers. Not every man involved in the fur trade negotiated prices or managed business affairs. Many served as laborers responsible for moving cargo. These men became the voyageurs. The profession developed because the fur trade required specialized transportation skills. A merchant in Montreal might purchase trade goods manufactured in Europe. Those goods then needed to travel hundreds, or even thousands of miles into the interior. There, they could be exchanged for furs. The furs would then make the long journey back east before eventually crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Every stage depended on reliable transportation. The farther the trade expanded inland, the greater this need became. A voyageur's work was physically demanding but highly specialized. He needed to paddle efficiently. He needed to understand navigation. He needed to survive in remote environments. He needed to cooperate closely with fellow crew members. A successful crew functioned almost like a single organism. Coordination mattered. Discipline mattered. Experience mattered. Mistakes could prove costly. A damaged canoe, lost cargo, or delayed journey could affect profits across an entire trading network. Most voyageurs came from French-speaking communities along the St. Lawrence River. Many were young men. Some began their careers as teenagers. Rural families often faced limited economic opportunities. Agriculture provided livelihoods, but available land was not unlimited. For ambitious young men, voyageur work offered a chance to earn wages. The pay was rarely spectacular, yet it could exceed what some laborers earned at home. The profession also carried a certain reputation. Voyageurs were known for endurance, strength, and toughness. Stories circulated about remarkable feats of physical labor. These stories sometimes became exaggerated over time, but they reflected genuine respect for the demands of the job. Employment usually involved contracts. A man agreed to serve for a specific period and perform specific duties. The trading company provided equipment and supplies. The voyageur provided labor. Contract terms varied depending on experience and responsibilities. Veteran voyageurs often earned more than inexperienced recruits. Trust was valuable. A company preferred workers who had proven themselves capable of surviving difficult journeys. As the fur trade expanded westward, a hierarchy developed among transportation workers. Some crews operated relatively close to settled areas. Others traveled far into the interior. The farther west a voyageur traveled, the more isolated his world became. Months could pass without seeing a major settlement. The forests seemed endless. The rivers stretched toward distant horizons. And beyond each bend in the water lay another stage in the growing commercial network that connected North America to the global economy. By the beginning of the 18th century, that network was becoming larger and more sophisticated every year. More goods were moving inland. More furs were moving outward. New trading posts appeared across vast regions. The demand for skilled canoe men continued to rise. Soon, entire communities would become tied to the seasonal rhythms of the voyageur trade. And as the trade pushed farther beyond the Great Lakes, the voyageurs would find themselves traveling through some of the most remote landscapes on the continent, carrying not only cargo but also the ambitions of an expanding colonial world. For many people living along the St. Lawrence River during the 18th century, the arrival of spring brought a familiar sight. As the ice retreated from rivers and waterways reopened, preparations for the trading season began. Merchants gathered supplies. Warehouses filled with cargo. Canoes were inspected and repaired. And young men considered whether they would spend another season in the settlements, or venture once again into the vast interior of North America. The fur trade depended on this annual cycle. Winter often brought travel to a halt across much of the canoe network. Ice blocked rivers. Lakes became hazardous. Transportation slowed dramatically. When warmer weather returned, activity surged. Crews assembled. Contracts were signed. Cargo was organized. Then the long journeys began. For many voyageurs, the profession was not a lifelong occupation. Some worked only a few seasons. Others remained in the trade for decades. A young man might join a crew in his late teens, attracted by wages, adventure, or the opportunity to see regions beyond his home community. The work demanded strength, but it also required endurance and experience. Veteran voyageurs often possessed knowledge that could not easily be learned from written instructions. They knew the rivers. They remembered difficult portages. They understood weather patterns. They recognized hazards that might be invisible to newcomers. The hiring process reflected the practical nature of the trade. Employers wanted workers who could perform difficult physical labor under challenging conditions. A voyageur might spend months carrying heavy loads, sleeping outdoors, enduring insects, storms, heat, cold, and exhaustion. Companies therefore preferred men with strong reputations. Reliability mattered. A crew member who abandoned his duties or failed to work effectively could create problems for everyone. Most voyageurs entered formal agreements before departure. These contracts outlined wages, responsibilities, and the duration of service. Surviving records reveal a surprisingly organized system. Many contracts specified exactly where a voyageur would travel and how long he would remain in service. Some agreements covered a single season. Others extended for multiple years. The details varied depending on distance, experience, and employer. In general, however, voyageurs occupied a position somewhere between skilled laborers and transportation specialists. They were not owners of the trade. They were not major merchants. Yet the entire system depended upon their labor. Without them, trade goods would not reach the interior. Without them, furs would not return to market. Wages reflected this importance, though not always generously. Most voyageurs did not become wealthy. Their earnings provided income, but fortunes were generally made by merchants and company investors rather than canoe crews. Nevertheless, voyageur wages often compared favorably with other opportunities available in rural communities. For some families, the income helped support farms and households. For others, it offered a path toward greater economic independence. Life on a trading expedition differed greatly from life in a settled village. A voyageur carried relatively few personal possessions. Space inside a canoe was valuable. Cargo took priority. Every pound mattered. As a result, clothing tended to be practical rather than elaborate. Shirts were often made from linen or other durable fabrics. Wool garments provided warmth during colder weather. Sashes became common features of voyageur clothing. These colorful belts served practical purposes. They helped support the lower back during heavy lifting and could also secure clothing or small items. Footwear varied depending on conditions. Moccasins proved especially useful in many environments. Lightweight and comfortable, they allowed efficient movement through forests and along portage trails. However, they wore out quickly. Many voyageurs carried materials for repairs because rough terrain could destroy footwear in a surprisingly short period. One of the most important concerns during any expedition was food. A man engaged in constant paddling and portaging required enormous amounts of energy. Modern studies of physically demanding labor suggest that such work can require thousands of calories each day. Voyageurs often performed this level of labor continuously for weeks or months. Their diet therefore focused on practicality. Food needed to be portable. It needed to remain usable during long journeys. It needed to provide sufficient energy. Among the most common staples were dried peas, hard bread, and salted pork. These foods could survive transportation and storage better than many fresh products. In some regions, crews also relied upon corn, dried fish, or locally obtained game. As the trade expanded westward, another food became particularly important. This was pemmican. Pemmican originated among indigenous peoples of the northern plains and surrounding regions. It was produced by combining dried meat with rendered fat and, in some cases, berries. The resulting food possessed remarkable qualities. It was lightweight. It stored well. It contained substantial nutritional value. And it could sustain travelers through long journeys. For fur trade companies operating across enormous distances, pemmican became one of the most valuable food resources available. Its importance would eventually contribute to major political and economic disputes in the Canadian interior. But for the voyageur, pemmican represented something simpler. It represented survival. Despite the hard labor, many observers noted that voyageurs often maintained a distinctive culture and identity. They developed traditions that helped endure the hardships of travel. One of the most famous involved singing. Songs helped establish rhythm during paddling. They provided entertainment during long days. They strengthened bonds among crew members. A canoe crossing a quiet lake might carry not only cargo but also the voices of voyageurs singing together as they traveled. These songs became part of the folklore of the fur trade. Some celebrated adventure. Others expressed homesickness. Some told humorous stories. Many reflected the realities of life far from home. Community mattered greatly within a canoe crew. The success of an expedition depended on cooperation. A large freight canoe might carry several men working together in confined conditions for months at a time. Arguments could occur, but teamwork remained essential. Every member depended on the others. A mistake during rough weather could endanger everyone. A careless action at a portage could damage valuable cargo. Mutual trust developed through shared experience. Many voyageurs spent years working alongside the same companions. The pace of daily life followed a demanding routine. Crews often rose before sunrise. Breakfast was simple and quick. Then paddling began. Hours passed on the water. Short breaks allowed meals or rest. Portages interrupted progress but also provided different forms of labor. The day might continue until evening. Only then would camp be established. Supper was prepared. Equipment was checked. The men rested before beginning again the next morning. This pattern repeated day after day, week after week, month after month. Modern observers sometimes focus on the adventure associated with the voyageur profession. There was certainly adventure. Many voyageurs traveled through regions that few Europeans had ever seen. They witnessed landscapes of extraordinary beauty. They encountered diverse peoples and cultures. They participated in one of the great transportation networks of early North America. Yet beneath the romance lay relentless labor. The fur trade depended not on occasional acts of heroism but on daily effort. Thousands of paddle strokes. Thousands of miles traveled. Thousands of pounds carried across portages. The voyageurs earned their reputation through repetition as much as courage. As the 18th century progressed, their skills became increasingly valuable. Trade routes extended farther west. Competition intensified. Larger trading networks emerged. And the men who mastered the rivers and lakes found themselves at the center of an economic system that was growing more ambitious with every passing decade. Soon, the canoe brigades departing from Montreal would push deeper into the continent than ever before, linking distant trading posts into a commercial empire that stretched across much of northern North America. Each spring, as ice loosened its grip on the rivers of eastern Canada, one of the most remarkable transportation operations in North America began once again. Along the waterfronts of Montreal, canoes were loaded with supplies destined for places so distant that many Europeans could scarcely imagine them. Bundles of cloth, iron tools, kettles, knives, axes, firearms, ammunition, trade goods of every kind. These items would travel hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles into the interior. Months later, many of the same canoes would return carrying a very different cargo. Bundles of fur collected from across an enormous wilderness. To modern eyes, it might seem astonishing that such a vast commercial system depended largely upon canoes. Yet for much of the 18th century, there was no practical alternative. The waterways of North America formed the transportation network. The voyageurs were its workforce. And every year, brigades of canoes set out to connect the distant regions of the fur trade. The journey often began in Montreal, which had become one of the most important commercial centers in New France and later in British North America. Located on the St. Lawrence River, Montreal occupied a strategic position. It stood near the gateway between settled agricultural communities and the immense interior. Merchants gathered there. Goods arrived from Europe. Trade agreements were arranged. Laborers were hired. For many voyageurs, Montreal represented the beginning of the season's work. The city itself was busy and growing. But only a short distance beyond its outskirts lay a very different world. A world of forests, rivers, lakes, and long stretches of wilderness. Once the canoes departed, they entered a route that generations of travelers had followed before them. The first stages of the journey carried crews westward along the Ottawa River. This river became one of the great highways of the fur trade. Flowing through rugged country, the Ottawa provided access toward the Great Lakes and the interior beyond. The route was beautiful, but it was not easy. Rapids interrupted navigation. Portages demanded hard labor. Strong currents challenged even experienced crews. Yet compared with attempting to move cargo through dense forests on foot, the river remained the best available option. The voyageurs measured distance differently from modern travelers. Today, distance is often expressed in miles or kilometers. For voyageurs, travel was frequently measured in days, portages, or familiar landmarks. A crew might know how long it usually took to reach a particular rapid or trading post. Experience created a mental map shaped by rivers rather than roads. As the canoes moved farther inland, the landscape changed. Settlements became less common. Signs of European agriculture disappeared. The forests seemed endless. Pine, spruce, birch, and countless other species covered enormous areas. Wildlife remained abundant. Moose moved through wetlands. Beavers built dams along streams. Bears wandered through the forests. Loons called across quiet lakes. For many voyageurs, these sights became part of everyday life. One of the most important characteristics of the trade routes was their interconnected nature. The voyageurs did not simply travel along a single river from beginning to end. Instead, they moved through a network. A river might lead to a lake. The lake might connect to another river. A portage might provide access to an entirely different watershed. Together, these routes formed a transportation system extending across much of northern North America. This network had existed in various forms for centuries before European arrival. Indigenous nations had long understood how waterways linked distant regions. The fur trade expanded and adapted these routes rather than creating them from nothing. As crews progressed westward, they eventually approached the Great Lakes. Among these lakes, none commanded more respect than Lake Superior. To a newcomer, Superior could be difficult to comprehend. Its surface area is so vast that standing on its shore often feels like standing beside an ocean. The horizon stretches far into the distance. Weather conditions can change rapidly. Calm water may become dangerous within hours. For voyageurs traveling in bark canoes, Lake Superior represented one of the most challenging portions of the journey. Storms posed constant threats. Strong winds could create powerful waves capable of overturning canoes. Because of these dangers, crews often stayed close to shore whenever possible. They learned to watch the sky carefully. Experience taught them when to travel and when to wait. Patience could save lives. Impatience could prove fatal. The route around Lake Superior became one of the most famous sections of the fur trade network. Travelers followed the rugged northern shoreline, stopping at known campsites and trading locations. Among the most important destinations was Grand Portage. Located near the western end of Lake Superior, Grand Portage became a critical hub in the transportation system. Its importance derived from geography. Beyond Lake Superior, additional waterways led deep into the interior. But reaching those waterways required crossing a lengthy portage trail. For generations, indigenous peoples had used this route. Fur trade companies later transformed it into one of the most significant transfer points in North America. Every summer, Grand Portage became a place of extraordinary activity. Canoes arrived from the east carrying trade goods. Other canoes arrived from the west carrying furs. Workers unloaded cargo. Bundles changed hands. Merchants negotiated business. News spread from one region to another. For a brief period each year, people from distant parts of the continent gathered in a single location. The annual meetings at Grand Portage revealed the immense scale of the fur trade. What appeared to be isolated journeys were actually parts of a vast economic system. Goods from Europe reached remote regions of the interior. Furs from distant forests eventually reached markets across the Atlantic. Information moved alongside the cargo. Political developments, market prices, exploration reports, personal letters, all traveled through the same network. Beyond Grand Portage, the routes became even more remote. Canoes entered the interior lake country that stretched toward present-day Manitoba and beyond. This region contained countless waterways. Some were large and easily navigable. Others required careful navigation through narrow channels and shallow rivers. Maps improved over time, but practical knowledge remained essential. A voyageur who understood local conditions possessed a valuable advantage. The farther west the trade expanded, the greater the logistical challenges became. Supplying distant trading posts required planning and coordination. A shortage of food or trade goods could affect entire regions. Delays could disrupt operations for months. Transportation therefore became the foundation upon which the entire system rested. The annual canoe brigades functioned almost like the arteries of a living organism. They carried resources, information, and people across enormous distances. Without them, the commercial empire of the fur trade could not have survived. Yet despite their importance, the journeys remained physically demanding. A typical day involved constant labor. The voyageurs paddled for hours. They carried cargo across portages. They repaired equipment. They established camps. Then they repeated the process the next day. And the next. And the next. Many travelers who witnessed these expeditions expressed admiration for the endurance of the crews. The distances covered each season were remarkable. Even more remarkable was the fact that such journeys became routine. For experienced voyageurs, what seemed extraordinary to outsiders was simply part of the job. As the 18th century continued, the trade routes extending west from Lake Superior grew increasingly important. Merchants saw opportunities for greater profits. Explorers sought new regions. Trading companies competed for influence. And beyond the familiar routes lay vast territories that Europeans had only begun to understand. The future of the fur trade would depend upon reaching those distant lands. And the voyageurs would be the men responsible for getting there. If the voyageurs were the transportation network of the fur trade, then indigenous nations were the foundation upon which the entire system rested. This fact was sometimes overlooked by later writers who preferred stories of European exploration and adventure. Yet the historical reality is difficult to ignore. Without indigenous knowledge, indigenous trade networks, indigenous labor, and indigenous partnerships, the fur trade would never have developed into the vast enterprise that stretched across northern North America. The voyageurs paddled across a continent, but they rarely traveled through an empty one. Long before French traders reached the interior, diverse indigenous nations occupied the forests, lakes, plains, and river valleys of the continent. These communities possessed their own political systems, economic relationships, diplomatic traditions, and cultural identities. They were not simply participants in the fur trade. They were independent peoples pursuing their own interests. Among the most important nations encountered by voyagers were the Anishinaabe peoples, a broad cultural grouping that included communities often known today as the Ojibwe or Chippewa. Across the Great Lakes region, Anishinaabe communities occupied strategically important territories connected to major waterways. French traders frequently relied upon their knowledge of routes, resources, and local conditions. Farther north and west, Cree communities became central figures in the expanding trade network. The Cree occupied vast regions extending across much of what is now central Canada. As trade expanded inland, many Cree groups adapted quickly to new economic opportunities. Some became important intermediaries between European traders and more distant indigenous nations. Their role helped extend the reach of the fur trade far beyond areas directly visited by French merchants. To the west, Assiniboine communities participated in networks that connected the forest regions with the northern plains. Other nations, including the Dean, Blackfoot, and many others, maintained their own relationships with traders depending on geography, local politics, and economic interests. The important point is that there was never a single indigenous experience of the fur trade. Different communities responded in different ways. Some embraced trade opportunities enthusiastically. Some approached Europeans cautiously. Some sought military alliances. Others attempted to limit outside influence. Many shifted strategies over time as circumstances changed. The fur trade became a constantly evolving relationship rather than a fixed system. European merchants often arrived with assumptions shaped by their own economic traditions. In Europe, commercial transactions generally involved direct exchanges governed by contracts, prices, and legal systems. Many indigenous societies possessed their own economic customs that did not always operate according to the same principles. Gift-giving, reciprocal obligations, kinship ties, and long-term relationships frequently played important roles in diplomacy and trade. As a result, successful traders learned that commerce involved much more than exchanging goods. Building trust mattered. Maintaining relationships mattered. Showing respect mattered. A trader who ignored these realities often struggled. One who understood them stood a better chance of success. French traders, in particular, developed reputations for forming relatively close relationships with indigenous communities. Part of this reflected necessity. French settlements remained small compared with the rapidly growing English colonies farther south. French influence in the interior depended heavily upon alliances. Trade, diplomacy, and cooperation became closely connected. Many voyagers spent long periods living among indigenous communities. They learned local languages. They adopted practical skills. They shared knowledge. In many cases, friendships and family connections developed. These relationships helped create a unique social world along the frontiers of the fur trade. The exchange of knowledge proved especially important. European traders introduced manufactured goods. Indigenous communities shared expertise regarding transportation, hunting, geography, survival, and local environments. Voyagers learned how to travel efficiently through unfamiliar landscapes. They learned which plants could be useful. They learned where food resources could be found. They learned techniques for enduring harsh winters. This knowledge often meant the difference between success and failure. In many regions, indigenous guides played crucial roles during expeditions. Maps remained incomplete for much of the fur trade era. Written descriptions could only provide limited information. An experienced guide who knew local waterways often possessed knowledge more valuable than any map available at the time. Explorers depended upon such expertise repeatedly. When later generations celebrated famous journeys across North America, they sometimes focused primarily on European leaders. Yet many of those expeditions succeeded because indigenous guides and communities provided essential assistance. The fur trade also altered indigenous societies in significant ways. Access to European goods created new opportunities. Metal tools often proved more durable and efficient than traditional alternatives. Iron axes could reduce labor. Firearms could improve hunting success under certain conditions. Cloth and manufactured products became increasingly common. At the same time, new dependencies sometimes emerged. Communities that became deeply involved in trade often adjusted hunting patterns to obtain furs for exchange. Economic priorities could shift. Political relationships could change. Competition over trade access sometimes intensified existing rivalries. The consequences varied across regions. Some communities gained influence and wealth. Others faced increasing challenges. Disease represented another profound factor. European contact introduced illnesses to which indigenous populations possessed little immunity. Smallpox, measles, and other diseases caused devastating losses in many areas. Entire communities suffered. Political structures were affected. Trade networks experienced disruption. The demographic consequences transformed large portions of North America long before many regions saw substantial European settlement. Voyageurs themselves witnessed these realities. As they traveled between trading posts and indigenous communities, they observed a continent undergoing enormous change. New economic relationships were forming. Traditional patterns were adapting. Political alliances were shifting. The fur trade did not simply move goods. It connected worlds. One of the most important outcomes of these relationships involved the emergence of new communities and identities. French traders and voyageurs sometimes married indigenous women or formed long-term family relationships. These unions created kinship networks that strengthened trade connections. Children born into such families often grew up familiar with both indigenous and European traditions. Over time, these communities would contribute to the development of the Métis people, whose history became deeply intertwined with the fur trade. But that story would grow larger in later generations. For now, what mattered most was cooperation. The canoe routes stretching across the continent depended upon countless human relationships. A trading post depended upon local partnerships. An explorer depended upon guides. A voyageur depended upon knowledge passed from one traveler to another. The economic success of the fur trade rested upon this web of connections. Yet as profitable as the trade became, it also attracted increasing competition. Merchants saw opportunities for expansion. Investors saw opportunities for profit. Rival companies began searching for ways to control larger portions of the trade. What had started as a collection of regional exchanges was evolving into a continental business. And in the decades ahead, two powerful organizations would compete for dominance across the northern wilderness. Their rivalry would transform the lives of voyageurs and reshape the history of North America. By the middle of the 18th century, the fur trade had already become one of the most important economic activities in northern North America. For generations, voyageurs had carried goods and furs across rivers, lakes, and portage trails stretching deep into the interior. Yet the trade was changing. The relatively simple networks of earlier decades were giving way to larger and more ambitious enterprises. Competition increased. Distances grew longer. Profits grew larger. And merchants began searching for ways to organize the trade on a scale that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. To understand why this transformation occurred, it is helpful to remember that the fur trade was not merely a local business. It was part of a global economy. A beaver trapped in the forests west of Lake Superior might eventually become a hat worn by a banker in London or a government official in Paris. The farther companies could reach into the interior, the greater their access to valuable furs. And the greater their access to furs, the greater the potential profits. The challenge was transportation. Every mile farther west increased costs. Trade goods had to be carried inland. Furs had to be carried outward. Employees needed food. Trading posts required supplies. Everything depended upon logistics. In modern business language, logistics refers to the movement and management of goods. For the fur trade, logistics often determined success or failure. A company that mastered transportation could expand. A company that failed to move goods efficiently could lose money even when fur supplies remained abundant. The voyageurs stood at the center of this challenge. They were not simply laborers carrying cargo. They were the human infrastructure that made the entire system function. As the trade expanded, their importance increased. One major event helped reshape the future of the fur trade. In 1763, the 7 Years' War came to an end. This conflict had been fought across multiple continents and involved many European powers. In North America, the war is often remembered as the French and Indian War. The result dramatically altered the political landscape. France lost most of its mainland possessions in North America. Britain emerged as the dominant imperial power in the region. For the people involved in the fur trade, however, economic realities often mattered more than political labels. The rivers still flowed. The beavers remained in the forests. Trade continued. Many French-speaking merchants and voyageurs remained active participants in the business. Over time, British commercial interests increasingly entered the trade. Rather than eliminating the existing system, they often adapted and expanded it. This produced a fascinating situation. Many of the people operating the trade continued to speak French. Many voyageur traditions remained unchanged. Yet the broader political environment had become British. The fur trade became one of the places where cultural boundaries blurred. French-speaking voyageurs worked for companies financed by merchants whose backgrounds varied widely. Economic opportunity often mattered more than ethnicity. By the 1770s and 1780s, merchants based in Montreal were becoming increasingly influential. These businessmen recognized that the greatest profits often came from reaching regions beyond the established trading zones. The farther west they traveled, the fewer competitors they encountered. New territories promised new supplies of fur. The problem was that expansion required enormous investment. Individual traders operating alone faced serious limitations. Large expeditions required canoes, equipment, food, employees, and trading goods. Maintaining distant posts required ongoing support. A single season of failure could produce major financial losses. Many merchants therefore concluded that cooperation offered advantages. Instead of competing individually, they could combine resources. This thinking eventually contributed to the rise of one of the most important organizations in fur trade history, the Northwest Company. Although its structure evolved over time, the company emerged during the late 18th century as a powerful partnership of Montreal-based merchants and traders. Its leaders understood something that earlier generations had learned repeatedly. The future of the fur trade lay farther west. To reach that future, they needed transportation networks capable of operating across extraordinary distances. The Northwest Company became famous for its ambition. Unlike some earlier traders who waited for indigenous suppliers to bring furs toward established centers, the company increasingly pushed its operations closer to the sources of production. Trading posts advanced deeper into the interior. Supply routes expanded. Voyageurs traveled farther than ever before. This strategy carried risks. Remote operations were expensive. Distances created logistical challenges. Communication could require months. A decision made in Montreal might not affect a distant post until the following season. Yet the rewards could be substantial. The company therefore embraced expansion. At the heart of this system stood a remarkable annual cycle. Each year, brigades departed from Montreal carrying trade goods toward the interior. At key transfer points, cargo changed hands. Some voyageurs specialized in routes linking Montreal to major distribution centers. Others operated farther west. Different crews became responsible for different segments of the network. This division of labor improved efficiency. No single crew needed to travel the entire distance. Instead, the transportation system functioned through coordination. One group carried supplies to a rendezvous point. Another group carried them farther west. Furs moved eastward through the same process. The scale of the operation was impressive. Thousands of packages moved through the system each year. Every package represented labor. Someone had carried it. Someone had paddled it across lakes. Someone had transported it across portages. The success of the company depended upon keeping this flow moving. To modern observers, the organization can appear almost industrial despite operating in a wilderness environment. There were schedules. There were supply chains. There were management structures. There were performance expectations. The difference was that the transportation network consisted of rivers rather than railroads. And the workforce moved by paddle rather than engine. One location became especially important to the Northwest Company. This was Grand Portage near the western end of Lake Superior. Every summer, the area came alive with activity. Voyageurs arrived from the east. Others arrived from the west. Merchants held meetings. Accounts were settled. Plans were discussed. Supplies were redistributed. News traveled across the continent. The gathering became one of the most important events in the annual fur trade calendar. Some historians have compared it to a combination of a business convention, transportation hub, and marketplace. People who had spent months in remote regions suddenly found themselves surrounded by fellow travelers. Stories were exchanged. Information spread rapidly. Decisions made during these meetings influenced operations across vast territories. For voyageurs, Grand Portage offered a brief interruption to the routine of travel. For company leaders, it provided an opportunity to evaluate the state of the trade. Was a region producing enough fur? Did a trading post require additional supplies? Were competitors becoming more active? Answers to such questions shaped future strategy. As the Northwest Company expanded, it pushed beyond areas familiar to earlier generations. Its employees entered territories that Europeans had scarcely explored. Rivers led toward distant watersheds. Lakes opened routes into unknown regions. Maps remained incomplete. The horizon of the trade continued to move westward. And with each new advance, the company became more dependent on the voyageurs who carried its ambitions across the continent. Yet success brought new challenges. The more profitable the Northwest Company became, the more attention it attracted. And somewhere to the north, another powerful organization was watching carefully. Unlike the Northwest Company, this rival already possessed a long history, royal support, and access to enormous resources. Before long, the competition between these two fur trade giants would become one of the defining struggles of the North American wilderness. When the leaders of the Northwest Company looked across the vast northern interior of North America, they saw opportunity. But they also saw a rival. Long before the Northwest Company emerged from the merchant communities of Montreal, another organization had already established itself as a major force in the fur trade. This organization was the Hudson's Bay Company. Its origins stretched back more than a century. In 1670, King Charles II of England granted a royal charter creating the company. The charter gave it extraordinary privileges, including trading rights over an immense region whose rivers drained into Hudson Bay. This territory became known as Rupert's Land, named after Prince Rupert, one of the company's most influential supporters. On a map, Rupert's Land appeared enormous. It covered millions of square miles. Much of it remained poorly understood by Europeans. Yet the company possessed a legal claim recognized by the English crown. For the leaders of Hudson's Bay Company, the strategy initially seemed straightforward. Rather than sending large numbers of employees deep into the interior, they established trading posts along the shores of Hudson Bay. Indigenous hunters and traders would bring furs to these coastal posts. The company would exchange goods and then ship the furs to Europe. This approach offered certain advantages. Transportation costs remained relatively manageable. Permanent coastal posts could be supplied by ships arriving directly from Europe. Employees did not need to maintain extensive inland networks. For many years, the strategy worked remarkably well. The company generated profits and expanded its influence. Yet geography eventually created a problem. The interior of North America was vast. Not every hunter wanted to travel hundreds of miles to reach Hudson Bay. Not every community viewed the coastal posts as convenient trading destinations. As French traders and later the Northwest Company pushed farther inland, they offered an alternative. Instead of waiting for furs to come to them, they brought trade goods directly to indigenous communities. This changed the competitive landscape. Imagine two merchants operating in the same region. One asks customers to travel long distances. The other travels to the customers. Over time, many customers may prefer the second option. The Northwest Company recognized this advantage and used it aggressively. Trading posts spread deeper into the wilderness. Voyageurs carried supplies into regions that Hudson's Bay Company had previously influenced from a distance. As a result, competition intensified. By the late 18th century, the rivalry had become one of the most important economic contests in North America. Both companies wanted access to the same fur-producing regions. Both sought partnerships with indigenous communities. Both wanted skilled employees. Both wanted profits. The contest extended across thousands of miles. For voyageurs, the competition created opportunities. Growing companies required workers. More trading posts required transportation. Expanding networks required experienced canoe crews. Demand for labor remained strong. Yet the rivalry also increased pressure. Companies expected efficiency. They expected larger volumes of trade. They expected employees to reach increasingly distant locations. The wilderness itself became a commercial battlefield. Unlike conventional wars fought with armies and artillery, this struggle centered on trade routes, logistics, and influence. A successful trading post could shift economic activity across an entire region. A new transportation route could alter established patterns of exchange. An alliance with a key indigenous community could affect the balance of power. As competition intensified, both companies expanded farther west. This movement transformed the geography of the fur trade. Regions that had once been distant frontiers became active commercial zones. New posts appeared along rivers and lakes. Supply lines stretched farther toward the Rocky Mountains. The voyageurs followed. Each expansion increased the complexity of the transportation network. A package of trade goods might pass through multiple hands before reaching its final destination. A bundle of furs might travel through several transfer points before arriving in Montreal. Coordinating these movements required planning and discipline. The annual rendezvous became increasingly important. At these gatherings, company leaders evaluated performance, assigned responsibilities, and discussed future strategy. Information represented a valuable resource. Knowing where fur supplies were increasing. Knowing where competitors were expanding. Knowing which routes offered advantages. All of this information influenced decision-making. The rivalry also encouraged exploration. Both companies wanted access to territories beyond those already known. New rivers might lead to new markets. New routes might reduce transportation costs. Unknown regions became economically significant because they might contain valuable fur resources. As a result, company employees often served as explorers. Many journeys that later appeared in the history books as great explorations began with practical commercial objectives. Merchants wanted information. Companies wanted profits. Exploration frequently emerged from those goals. Among the people most affected by this expansion were the voyageurs themselves. The distances they traveled continued to increase. Some crews operated in regions so remote that communication with eastern settlements might require an entire year. A voyageur leaving Montreal could spend months moving westward through an immense network of waterways. By the time he reached certain interior posts, he might be thousands of miles from the city where his journey began. Yet despite these distances, a shared culture developed among many participants in the trade. Voyageurs, clerks, interpreters, traders, guides, and indigenous partners all contributed to a world connected by rivers and commerce. Different languages could be heard at trading posts. French remained common. Various indigenous languages remained essential. English became increasingly important. Cultural boundaries often overlapped. People adapted to practical realities. Success depended upon communication and cooperation. One consequence of the rivalry was rising costs. To attract trade, companies sometimes offered better terms. To maintain influence, they established additional posts. To support expansion, they hired more employees. Competition can stimulate growth, but it can also reduce profits. By the early 19th century, both major companies were feeling the financial strain created by their struggle. Neither side wanted to surrender territory. Neither side wanted to lose influence. The result was an increasingly intense contest across the northern interior. In some regions, rival posts appeared only a short distance apart. Employees from competing companies watched one another closely. Each side attempted to gain advantages without triggering outright conflict. Most of the time, trade remained the primary weapon, but tensions occasionally ran higher. As the rivalry expanded westward, another important development was taking shape. The fur trade was no longer simply connecting Europeans and indigenous communities. A distinct society was emerging within the trade itself. Families were being formed. Communities were growing. Children were being raised in a world shaped by multiple cultural traditions. These developments would eventually contribute to the rise of one of the most important peoples in the history of the fur trade, the Métis. Their story would become deeply connected to the voyageurs, the companies, and the future of Western North America. And as the great rivalry between Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company continued, that emerging society would help shape the next chapter of the continent's history. As the fur trade expanded across northern North America, thousands of people spent their lives moving between worlds. Voyageurs paddled along rivers that connected distant regions. Traders negotiated with communities separated by vast distances. Indigenous hunters supplied furs that would eventually reach markets across the Atlantic. For months at a time, employees of the trading companies lived far from major settlements. In this environment, relationships developed that would shape the future of the continent. The fur trade was not only an economic system. It was also a human system. People worked together. They traveled together. They formed friendships. They built families. And over time, these relationships gave rise to new communities whose identities reflected multiple cultural traditions. Among the most important of these communities were the Métis. The story of the Métis cannot be reduced to a simple origin. It developed gradually over generations. In many regions of the fur trade, French-speaking voyageurs, traders, and company employees formed relationships with indigenous women. These relationships often created strong family and trade connections. From the perspective of the companies, such relationships could provide practical advantages. Kinship ties strengthened alliances. Trust became easier to establish. Communication improved. Knowledge could be shared more effectively. From the perspective of many indigenous communities, these relationships also had value. Family connections created obligations and responsibilities that could reinforce cooperation. Yet these relationships were much more than business arrangements. They involved real people building real lives. Children were born into families connected to both indigenous and European traditions. They grew up hearing multiple languages. They learned different cultural practices. They often moved comfortably between communities that outsiders viewed as separate. Over time, many of these families developed identities that were neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous. A distinct culture emerged. This culture eventually became known as Métis. The word itself comes from a French term referring to mixed ancestry. However, the Métis became much more than a description of ancestry. They developed communities, traditions, social networks, and a collective identity of their own. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Métis communities had become an important presence across large portions of the fur trade world. Many lived in regions where major transportation routes intersected. Others settled near trading posts or along important rivers. Some worked directly in the fur trade. Others hunted, farmed, transported goods, or engaged in a variety of economic activities. The lives of the Métis were deeply connected to the rhythms of the trade. Seasonal travel often shaped family life. A voyageur might spend months away from home. Trading expeditions followed annual cycles. Communities adapted accordingly. Children grew up in environments where mobility was normal. Knowledge of geography became part of everyday life. Many individuals possessed remarkable familiarity with regions stretching across hundreds of miles. Language reflected this blending of traditions. French remained important in many communities. Various indigenous languages continued to be spoken. Over time, unique forms of communication developed. One example was Michif, a language associated with many Métis communities. Michif combined elements of French and indigenous languages in ways that reflected the cultural history of the people who spoke it. To linguists, Michif remains one of the most fascinating languages in North America because it preserves evidence of cultural interaction across generations. Culture appeared in other forms as well. Music became an important part of community life. Fiddle traditions developed strong roots in many Métis settlements. Songs and dances reflected influences from multiple sources. Clothing styles blended practical needs with cultural expression. Food traditions incorporated ingredients and techniques from different backgrounds. Rather than existing between cultures, many Métis communities created cultures of their own. The fur trade provided the environment in which these developments occurred. Yet the Métis were not merely passive products of the trade. They became active participants who shaped the system. Many worked as voyageurs. Others became interpreters, guides, hunters, traders, and intermediaries. Their ability to navigate multiple cultural worlds often made them especially valuable. A company employee arriving at a distant trading post might depend upon Métis workers who understood local geography, languages, and customs. Knowledge remained one of the most important resources in the fur trade. The people who possessed that knowledge frequently occupied influential positions. The importance of family networks should not be underestimated. Modern economies often emphasize formal institutions and written contracts. The fur trade depended heavily upon personal relationships. Family connections could influence employment opportunities. Kinship ties could facilitate trade. Trust often developed through networks of relatives and long-term acquaintances. As a result, family history became deeply intertwined with commercial history. Some of the most influential figures in the fur trade emerged from these interconnected worlds. At the same time, life remained challenging. The frontier environment demanded resilience. Distances remained enormous. Weather remained unpredictable. Economic conditions could change rapidly. A successful trading season might be followed by a difficult one. Disease continued to affect communities across the continent. Yet despite these challenges, Métis communities expanded and adapted. By the early 19th century, they had become a significant force in Western North America. One reason for this growth involved transportation. The same skills that made voyageurs valuable also benefited Métis communities. Knowledge of rivers, lakes, trails, and seasonal conditions created opportunities. Many Métis men became highly respected canoemen, guides, and transport workers. Others participated in the buffalo hunts that supplied food to the fur trade. These hunts became particularly important because of a food called pemmican. Earlier, we briefly discussed pemmican as a portable and nutritious source of energy. Its importance deserves closer attention. As the fur trade expanded westward, supplying distant posts became increasingly difficult. Traditional food sources could not always meet demand. Pemmican offered a solution. Produced primarily from dried buffalo meat and fat, it could be stored for long periods and transported efficiently. For company employees operating in remote regions, pemmican often meant survival. As a result, control of pemmican supplies became economically significant. Métis communities played a major role in its production and distribution. What might seem like a simple food resource therefore became a strategic commodity. The future of entire trading networks could depend upon access to it. The growing importance of the Métis reflected a broader reality. The fur trade was creating a new society across the northern interior. This society did not fit neatly into European categories. Nor did it simply preserve older patterns unchanged. Instead, it evolved through interaction, adaptation, and cooperation. Voyageurs, indigenous peoples, traders, missionaries, guides, and families all contributed to its development. The result was one of the most distinctive cultural landscapes in North American history. Yet while communities were growing and cultures were evolving, the commercial competition driving the fur trade continued to intensify. The Northwest Company wanted more territory. The Hudson's Bay Company wanted to protect its influence. Explorers pushed farther into unknown regions. Maps expanded. Profits remained the ultimate goal. And increasingly, the future of the trade seemed to depend upon reaching places that few Europeans had ever seen. Beyond the forests and lake country lay immense northern rivers, the Rocky Mountains, and perhaps even routes leading all the way to the Pacific Ocean. For ambitious merchants and explorers, these possibilities were impossible to ignore. And among the men who would attempt those journeys, some would become famous throughout the history of North America. By the closing decades of the 18th century, much of North America remained a mystery to Europeans. Maps had improved considerably since the days of Samuel de Champlain, yet enormous blank spaces still covered large portions of the continent. Merchants knew where many rivers flowed. Trading posts marked important locations. Travel routes connected distant regions. But beyond these familiar corridors lay vast territories that few Europeans had seen. What lay beyond the great forests? Could rivers provide a practical route to the Pacific Ocean? Was there a water connection that would allow trade to cross the continent? Questions such as these fascinated merchants, explorers, governments, and investors alike. The search for answers became one of the great geographical quests of the age. And once again, the voyageurs stood at the center of the story. Popular history often celebrates explorers as solitary heroes standing at the edge of the unknown. The reality was usually more complicated. Explorers rarely traveled alone. Their success depended upon guides, interpreters, indigenous knowledge, and transportation crews. An explorer might receive credit for a journey, but dozens of people often made that journey possible. No figure illustrates this reality better than Alexander Mackenzie. Today, Mackenzie is remembered as one of the most important explorers in Canadian history. His name appears on maps, rivers, highways, and historical monuments. Yet his achievements depended heavily upon the labor and expertise of the voyageurs and indigenous peoples who traveled alongside him. Born in Scotland in 1764, Mackenzie eventually entered the fur trade and became associated with the North West Company. Like many ambitious traders of his generation, he understood that exploration and commerce often went hand in hand. New routes could create new opportunities. Geographical knowledge could generate profits. The farther a company expanded, the more valuable reliable information became. In 1789, Mackenzie launched an expedition that aimed to solve one of the great geographical mysteries of the era. Many Europeans hoped that rivers flowing westward through the interior might provide access to the Pacific Ocean. Such a route could transform trade and increase the influence of whichever nation or company controlled it. Mackenzie and his companions set out from the fur trade interior with this possibility in mind. Their expedition traveled northward along a massive river system. For weeks they moved through landscapes few Europeans had previously documented. The river seemed promising. It was broad. It was navigable. It carried tremendous volumes of water. Yet there was a problem. The farther they traveled, the more apparent it became that the river was not flowing toward the Pacific. Instead, it flowed north. Eventually, the expedition reached the Arctic Ocean. The achievement was significant. Europeans now possessed far better knowledge of northern geography. The river itself would later bear Mackenzie's name. Today it is known as the Mackenzie River, one of the longest river systems in North America. Yet from the perspective of Mackenzie's original objective, the expedition had failed. He had not reached the Pacific. The hope for western route remained undiscovered. Many explorers would have accepted the result and moved on. Mackenzie did not. He remained convinced that a route to the Pacific could be found. The challenge was enormous. The continent stretched across thousands of miles. Mountain ranges remained poorly understood. Maps contained inaccuracies. Communication between distant regions remained slow. Yet the possibility of reaching the Pacific continued to inspire him. Over the next several years, Mackenzie gathered information from traders, voyageurs, and indigenous communities. Knowledge accumulated gradually. Every conversation provided clues. Every trading route added pieces to the geographical puzzle. One of the most important lessons came from indigenous peoples who already possessed extensive understanding of Western landscapes. European explorers often depended upon such knowledge. Indigenous travelers had crossed mountain passes, followed river systems, and maintained trade connections long before Europeans arrived. Without their guidance, many expeditions would never have succeeded. In 1793, Mackenzie made a second attempt. This journey would become one of the most famous expeditions in North American history. The expedition traveled westward through a complex network of rivers and portages. The voyageurs performed the labor that made progress possible. They paddled canoes through difficult waters. They carried supplies across rough terrain. They endured insects, weather, fatigue, and uncertainty. Day after day, they pushed deeper into territory unfamiliar to most Europeans. The farther west they traveled, the more challenging the geography became. Rivers narrowed. Currents strengthened. Portages increased. Mountain barriers appeared. The Rocky Mountains represented one of the greatest obstacles on the continent. Crossing them required determination, local knowledge, and careful planning. Again, indigenous assistance proved essential. Guides provided information regarding routes and conditions. Communities shared geographical knowledge accumulated over generations. The expedition's success depended upon cooperation. Eventually, after months of effort, Mackenzie and his companions reached the Pacific coast. In doing so, he became the first known person of European descent to complete an overland crossing of North America north of Mexico and reach the Pacific Ocean. The achievement occurred more than a decade before the famous American expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. From a geographical perspective, the journey was extraordinary. From a commercial perspective, however, the results were more complicated. The route was difficult. Mountain barriers remained formidable. Transportation challenges limited immediate economic benefits. Yet the expedition demonstrated something important. The continent could be crossed. The Pacific coast was reachable. The western interior was becoming better understood. Knowledge itself possessed value. Maps improved. Future traders gained information. Governments acquired a clearer understanding of territory and resources. The Voyageurs' contribution to these achievements deserves special attention. Mackenzie became famous. His name entered history books. But the expedition moved at the speed of paddles. It depended upon men capable of carrying hundreds of pounds across portages. It depended upon crews willing to work under extremely difficult conditions. Exploration and transportation remained inseparable. The same pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the fur trade era. A celebrated explorer often stood at the front of a much larger effort. Behind him were voyageurs, indigenous guides, interpreters, hunters, and countless others whose labor made exploration possible. The Northwest Company recognized the value of such achievements. Every new route expanded possibilities. Every geographical discovery offered potential commercial advantages. As a result, exploration became woven into the culture of the company itself. Employees were encouraged to gather information. Maps improved year after year. Knowledge spread through annual meetings and trading networks. By the beginning of the 19th century, much of northern North America had become far better known than it had been only a few decades earlier. Yet many challenges remained. Competition between the major fur trade companies continued to intensify. Transportation networks stretched across unprecedented distances. Costs increased. Profits came under pressure. And while explorers expanded the boundaries of geographical knowledge, the daily realities of life in the fur trade remained as demanding as ever. For every famous expedition, thousands of ordinary journeys continued across rivers, lakes, and portages. The voyageurs carried the burden of that work. And nowhere was that burden felt more strongly than in the remote Athabasca country, where some of the longest and most difficult routes in the entire fur trade world awaited them. Among all the regions connected to the fur trade, few acquired a reputation as formidable as Athabasca country. To many merchants in Montreal, the name represented opportunity. To company investors, it represented profits. To explorers, it represented the edge of the known world. But to the voyageurs who actually traveled there, Athabasca often meant something else entirely. It meant distance. Extraordinary distance. The fur trade had always required endurance, but Athabasca pushed endurance to its limits. Located far beyond Lake Superior and well west of the traditional Great Lakes routes, the Athabasca region occupied a vast area connected to the drainage systems of northern Canada. The territory included immense forests, lakes, rivers, wetlands, and some of the richest fur-producing areas on the continent. For companies such as the Northwest Company, the region became increasingly important because beaver populations closer to eastern trade centers had already experienced heavy trapping pressure. The farther west traders traveled, the more likely they were to find new supplies of valuable pelts. The rewards could be substantial. So could the costs. By the late 18th century, Athabasca had become one of the most profitable regions in the entire fur trade. Yet every pound of cargo entering or leaving the region required transportation across astonishing distances. There were no roads. There were no railways. There were no mechanical engines. Everything depended on canoes, rivers, portages, and human labor. A bale of trade goods loaded in Montreal might pass through numerous hands before reaching a distant Athabasca post. Months could pass between departure and arrival. The same was true for furs traveling eastward. Every stage required coordination. Every delay increased costs. This was one reason the Northwest Company placed such importance on experienced voyageurs. A transportation network extending thousands of miles could function only if its workers remained dependable. The farther west the trade expanded, the more valuable skilled labor became. Athabasca crews developed almost legendary reputations within the fur trade. Other voyageurs respected them. Company officials relied upon them. The routes they traveled ranked among the most difficult in North America. A voyageur assigned to Athabasca country knew he would face long periods away from major settlements. He knew the work would be exhausting. He knew the risks would be substantial. Yet many accepted these assignments because they often offered higher wages than shorter routes. The companies understood that difficult work required incentives. Higher pay helped attract experienced men. Even then, life in Athabasca demanded sacrifice. The annual cycle of travel became increasingly complex as distance increased. Cargo moving from Montreal toward the interior often passed through a series of transfer points. Different crews handled different sections of the route. This system helped maintain efficiency. No single crew could reasonably manage every stage. The network functioned because thousands of individual tasks fit together into a larger whole. One group transported supplies to a rendezvous. Another group carried them farther west. A third group moved them deeper into the interior. The process resembled a relay. The cargo continued moving even as individual crews changed. At the center of this system stood the voyageurs. The physical realities of travel remained relentless. Paddling consumed hours every day. Portages consumed additional energy. Equipment required maintenance. Food had to be prepared. Weather had to be endured. The work never truly stopped. A successful voyageur learned how to conserve energy without reducing effort. He learned how to pace himself. He learned how to endure discomfort. Many travelers who visited fur trade country remarked on the remarkable stamina displayed by experienced crews. Part of that stamina came from practice. A man who spent years carrying heavy loads developed strength. But experience mattered just as much. Veterans understood how to distribute weight. They knew how to navigate difficult terrain. They recognized when weather conditions demanded caution. Knowledge reduced risk. Knowledge improved efficiency. And in Athabasca country, efficiency often meant survival. Food remained a constant concern. The farther a post stood from major supply centers, the more difficult it became to maintain reliable provisions. Imported food could not always meet demand. Transportation costs were simply too high. Local resources therefore played a crucial role. Fish, game, and especially pemmican became essential. The importance of pemmican increased dramatically as the Western trade expanded. A single bag of pemmican contained tremendous nutritional value relative to its weight. For voyageurs carrying heavy loads over long distances, this mattered enormously. A transportation system operating across the northern wilderness required compact and reliable food supplies. Pemmican met that need better than almost any available alternative. Its value extended far beyond nutrition. It became one of the strategic foundations of the Western fur trade. Entire supply chains depended upon it. Company leaders understood this reality well. A shortage of pemmican could affect trading operations across vast regions. As a result, securing access to food resources became almost as important as securing access to fur. Meanwhile, the environment itself presented constant challenges. Winter arrived early in many northern regions. Ice could halt travel. Spring floods could damage transportation routes. Summer insects tormented travelers and animals alike. Mosquitoes became infamous throughout fur trade country. Contemporary accounts often described clouds of insects so dense that they seemed almost impossible to escape. For modern readers, such descriptions can sound exaggerated. Yet many independent observers reported similar experiences. The northern wilderness could be beautiful. It could also be extraordinarily difficult. Isolation created another challenge. A voyageur stationed in Athabasca country might spend months without receiving news from the outside world. Events occurring in Europe, Montreal, or even a neighboring district might remain unknown for long periods. Communication moved only as fast as transportation. This reality shaped the psychology of frontier life. Patience became necessary. Self-reliance became valuable. People learned to focus on immediate responsibilities because distant events often remained beyond their control. Yet despite these hardships, many voyageurs developed strong attachments to the regions where they worked. The wilderness possessed a beauty that impressed countless travelers. Northern rivers flowed through landscapes that seemed endless. Autumn forests reflected brilliant colors. Winter skies filled with stars and northern lights. Spring transformed frozen waterways into living routes of travel once again. People who spent years in such environments often formed deep connections with them. Athabasca country therefore represented a paradox. It was one of the hardest regions in the fur trade. It was also one of the most important. Its furs generated profits. Its routes encouraged exploration. Its challenges forged some of the most experienced voyageurs in North America. And as the trade expanded deeper into the West, Athabasca became a gateway to territories that remained only partially understood. Beyond those territories stood mountain ranges, river systems, and distant lands that continued to attract the attention of traders and explorers alike. But while the companies focused on expansion, another problem was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The very success of the fur trade was beginning to create pressures that would eventually threaten the system itself. Competition was growing more intense. Costs were rising. And the struggle between the great fur trade companies was moving toward a dangerous new phase. By the early 19th century, the fur trade had reached a point of remarkable success. Trading posts stretched across enormous distances. Voyageurs connected regions separated by thousands of miles. The Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company controlled networks that would have seemed unimaginable a century earlier. Furs continued to flow toward European markets. Profits continued to attract investors. On the surface, the system appeared strong. Yet beneath that success, tensions were building. The farther the trade expanded, the more complicated it became. Transportation costs increased. Competition intensified. And one seemingly simple product was becoming increasingly important to the survival of the entire enterprise. That product was pemmican. At first glance, pemmican hardly appeared worthy of political conflict. It was not gold. It was not silver. It was not a luxury commodity desired by wealthy consumers. Instead, it was a practical food. Usually made from dried buffalo meat mixed with rendered fat, pemmican provided an efficient source of energy for travelers operating in difficult environments. For centuries, indigenous peoples had produced and used it successfully. The fur trade adopted it because it solved a critical logistical problem. The Western trade depended on transportation. Transportation depended on labor. Labor depended on food. The farther voyagers traveled from agricultural settlements, the harder it became to supply them. Traditional European food supplies often proved expensive and difficult to transport. Pemmican offered a better solution. It stored well. It traveled well. It provided substantial nutrition relative to its weight. Most importantly, it allowed canoe brigades and remote trading posts to function. Without pemmican, much of the Western fur trade would have struggled to survive. As demand increased, entire economic systems developed around its production. Across the northern plains, large buffalo hunts became an important part of life for many Métis communities. These hunts required organization, cooperation, and skill. Participants traveled across vast grasslands in search of buffalo herds. The buffalo provided meat, hides, and other valuable resources. A portion of the meat was processed into pemmican. The finished product then entered the supply networks of the fur trade. In effect, buffalo on the plains were helping sustain voyagers hundreds of miles away. The relationship between food production and transportation became increasingly important. Control over pemmican supplies therefore carried economic significance. And where economic significance existed, competition often followed. One region became particularly important in this developing story. This was the Red River area, located near present-day Manitoba. The Red River occupied a strategic position within the fur trade world. Transportation routes passed nearby. Métis communities lived throughout the region. Buffalo hunting remained important. The area possessed both economic and geographical value. In the early 19th century, the Red River region also became the site of a colonial experiment that would have far-reaching consequences. Thomas Douglas, better known as Lord Selkirk, was a Scottish nobleman with an interest in colonization. Concerned about poverty and displacement affecting many people in Scotland, he sought opportunities to establish agricultural settlements in North America. In 1811, he obtained a large land grant from the Hudson's Bay Company. This grant included portions of the Red River region. The resulting settlement became known as the Red River Colony. From Selkirk's perspective, the project offered humanitarian and economic benefits. Settlers could establish farms. Communities could grow. Agriculture could support local populations. Yet the situation appeared very different from the perspective of many people associated with the Northwest Company and the existing fur trade economy. The colony occupied territory that lay near important transportation routes. Its presence raised concerns about access to resources. It also introduced new political complications into an already competitive environment. What followed was not a simple disagreement. It was a struggle involving economic interests, transportation networks, land use, food supplies, and competing visions for the future of the region. The Northwest Company depended heavily on Western transportation routes. The Hudson's Bay Company supported the Red River Colony. Métis communities possessed their own interests and priorities. Each group viewed developments through a different lens. Tensions gradually increased. The issue of pemmican soon became central. In 1814, the governor of the Red River Colony issued what became known as the Pemmican Proclamation. The proclamation restricted the export of pemmican and certain other food products from the colony. Supporters argued that local settlers required sufficient food supplies. Critics saw something else. From the perspective of many involved in the Northwest Company's Western operations, the proclamation threatened a critical component of their transportation network. If pemmican could not move freely, voyagers and remote posts might suffer shortages. The consequences could be serious. What might appear to modern observers as a dispute over food quickly became a dispute over power. Economic competition intensified. Political tensions rose. Relationships between various groups became increasingly strained. The situation was further complicated by the fact that many Métis communities participated directly in the pemmican trade. Restrictions affecting pemmican therefore affected their economic activities as well. The result was growing resentment. Throughout the region, people debated authority, rights, and access to resources. The conflict did not emerge from a single cause. Rather, it developed from multiple overlapping issues: trade, food, transportation, settlement, land, politics, identity. All became intertwined. For voyageurs moving through the region, these tensions were impossible to ignore. The routes they traveled now crossed areas where competing interests collided. Company rivalries that once centered primarily on commerce increasingly affected daily life. In some locations, employees of rival companies viewed one another with open hostility. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Rumors spread. Arguments intensified. The fur trade remained a business. But it was becoming a business conducted in an atmosphere of growing conflict. The years that followed brought a series of confrontations that shocked many observers. Economic competition began spilling into physical confrontation. The struggle between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company was no longer confined to trading posts and accounting books. It was becoming personal. And at the center of that changing world stood the Métis communities whose economic activities, family networks, and regional influence had become impossible for either company to ignore. The peaceful rhythm of paddles moving across northern waterways continued. Voyageurs still carried cargo. Trading posts still exchanged goods. Yet beneath that familiar routine, the balance of power in the fur trade world was beginning to shift. The conflict would soon reach a dramatic turning point, and its consequences would reshape the future of the entire northern trade. The fur trade is often remembered through images of quiet rivers, long canoe journeys, and distant wilderness landscapes. For much of its history, trade depended upon cooperation. Voyageurs worked together in crews. Companies relied upon indigenous partnerships. Trading posts exchanged goods rather than gunfire. Yet no economic system exists entirely free from conflict. By the second decade of the 19th century, tensions that had been building for years were becoming increasingly difficult to contain. The rivalry between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company had reached a dangerous stage. Both organizations wanted influence. Both wanted access to resources. Both wanted control of transportation routes and trade networks. Neither wanted to surrender territory to the other. For years, competition had largely centered on commerce. Now it was beginning to affect communities throughout the western interior. The Red River region stood at the center of these disputes. As we explored previously, the establishment of the Red River Colony introduced new political and economic pressures into a landscape already shaped by trade. Métis communities, company employees, settlers, and colonial officials all possessed different priorities. The result was a complicated and increasingly unstable situation. Many Métis viewed restrictions on the pemmican trade as a direct threat to their economic livelihood. The buffalo hunts and pemmican production that supported the western fur trade were not merely commercial activities. They were part of the social and economic fabric of Métis life. Attempts to regulate that trade therefore generated strong reactions. At the same time, company rivalries encouraged suspicion. Actions taken by one side were often interpreted as deliberate efforts to weaken the other. Trust became difficult to maintain. Throughout the region, tensions continued to rise. The situation reached a turning point in 1816. That year, events unfolded that would become known as the Battle of Seven Oaks. Although the term battle is commonly used, the encounter was relatively small when compared with major military engagements of the era. Yet its significance far exceeded the number of people involved. The confrontation occurred near the Red River colony. A group associated with the colony encountered a larger Métis force led by Cuthbert Grant. Grant was a prominent Métis leader whose influence extended across the region. Exactly how the encounter escalated remains a subject of historical discussion. Accounts differ. Participants remembered events differently. As often happens during moments of tension, later interpretations reflected competing perspectives. What is clear is that violence erupted. When the confrontation ended, more than 20 people connected to the colony had been killed. The event shocked observers. News spread quickly through fur trade networks. The deaths intensified existing tensions and hardened attitudes on multiple sides. For many people, Seven Oaks symbolized the extent to which commercial competition had escaped its traditional boundaries. The fur trade was no longer merely a contest between rival businesses. Political authority, community identity, and regional power had become deeply involved. The aftermath produced a wave of accusations and counter-accusations. Each side sought to justify its actions. Each side blamed the other. Colonial officials attempted to restore order. Company leaders worried about the effect of continued instability. Investors feared that prolonged conflict might threaten profits. The violence revealed an uncomfortable reality. The competition between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company had become expensive. It had become disruptive. And increasingly it was becoming unsustainable. To understand why, it helps to consider the economics of the situation. Competition can encourage innovation and efficiency. But extreme competition can also create waste. Both companies had spent years establishing rival posts in the same regions. Both maintained extensive transportation systems. Both hired large numbers of employees. Both invested heavily in expansion. In many areas, they were duplicating each other's efforts. Maintaining these overlapping networks consumed enormous resources. Profits remained possible, but costs continued to rise. At the same time, changes were occurring in the wider world. Europe was emerging from the long period of conflict associated with the Napoleonic Wars. Global markets were evolving. Economic conditions were shifting. The fur trade remained important, but its future was no longer as certain as it had once seemed. Company leaders began considering options that would have appeared unthinkable only a few decades earlier. Perhaps continued rivalry was no longer the best path forward. Perhaps cooperation offered greater advantages. The idea of merging the two great companies had surfaced occasionally in earlier years. Now it began attracting more serious attention. A merger promised several benefits. Competition would end. Costs could be reduced. Transportation networks could be coordinated more efficiently. Trading posts could be consolidated. The risk of further conflict might decline. For investors and company executives, these advantages appeared increasingly attractive. Yet such a transformation would not be simple. Both organizations possessed long histories. Both employed thousands of people. Both had developed distinct cultures and traditions. Merging them required negotiation, compromise, and careful planning. While discussions continued among company leaders, life in the fur trade carried on. Voyageurs still launched canoes at the beginning of each season. Portages still demanded exhausting labor. Trading posts still required supplies. The rivers remained the great highways of the North. To many ordinary workers, the larger political and economic debates felt distant. Their immediate concerns remained practical. Would the weather cooperate? Would food supplies last? Would cargo arrive safely? Would the journey be completed before winter? Yet even those focused on daily responsibilities could sense that change was coming. The era of relentless expansion was slowing. The age of fierce corporate rivalry was approaching a crossroads. The great transportation system built by generations of voyageurs had reached its peak. For more than a century, canoe brigades had carried the commerce of a continent. They had connected forests, rivers, plains, and distant trading posts into a single economic network. Now the institutions that depended upon those routes were preparing to enter a new phase. In 1821, after years of competition and conflict, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company would formally unite. The merger would transform the fur trade. It would reshape the lives of voyageurs. And it would mark the beginning of the end of one of the most remarkable commercial rivalries in North American history. Yet the merger would not immediately end the story. In many ways, it would begin an entirely new chapter. The voyageurs would continue their work. The rivers would continue to carry canoes. But the world around them was changing. And those changes would eventually challenge the very foundations of the transportation system they had spent generations building. In 1821, after decades of rivalry, expansion, and conflict, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company became a single organization. For many people involved in the fur trade, the merger marked the end of an era. The fierce competition that had shaped the western interior for generations was finally over. The duplicate trading posts, the overlapping transportation routes, the expensive struggle for influence, all of it had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The newly enlarged Hudson's Bay Company inherited an enormous commercial empire. Its reach extended across vast portions of northern North America. Trading posts dotted rivers and lakes stretching from Hudson Bay toward the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Thousands of employees remained connected to the system. Among them were the voyageurs. For the men who spent their lives paddling canoes, the merger produced mixed consequences. On one hand, the reduction of competition brought greater stability. Violence declined. Business operations became more predictable. Supply networks could be coordinated more efficiently. On the other hand, efficiency often meant fewer jobs. When rival companies operate separate transportation systems, both require employees. When those systems are combined, duplication becomes unnecessary. Some posts closed. Some routes were consolidated. Some positions disappeared. The very process that strengthened the company also reduced opportunities for certain workers. This was not unusual. Throughout history, large organizations often seek efficiency after mergers. The fur trade proved no different. Yet despite these changes, the voyageur profession did not vanish overnight. The canoe brigades continued operating. Trading posts still required supplies. Furs still needed transportation. The geography of the continent had not changed. Rivers remained the principal routes through much of the northern interior. For several decades after the merger, experienced voyageurs continued to play important roles within the system. The difference was that the age of rapid expansion had ended. The great era of exploration was largely over. Most major transportation routes had already been identified. Many regions once considered remote frontiers were now familiar components of the trade network. The focus shifted from expansion toward management. Company officials sought to make existing operations more efficient rather than constantly pushing into new territories. This transition reflected broader developments occurring throughout North America. Population growth accelerated. Agricultural settlement expanded. Governments increased their presence in regions previously dominated by trade companies. What had once been wilderness frontiers gradually became more connected to the outside world. The fur trade no longer stood alone as the defining economic force across the continent. Other industries began growing in importance. Timber became increasingly valuable. Agriculture expanded into new regions. Mining attracted investment and labor. Economic diversity increased. As a result, the relative importance of the fur trade slowly declined. Environmental factors also played a role. For generations, trapping had targeted beaver populations across enormous areas. Although beavers did not disappear, heavy harvesting affected local populations in many regions. Trappers often needed to travel farther to obtain the same quantities of fur. Transportation costs increased. Profit margins came under pressure. The economics that had fueled earlier expansion became more difficult to sustain. At the same time, consumer preferences in Europe began changing. Fashion had helped create the fur trade. Fashion could also weaken it. The enormous demand for beaver felt hats that once drove the industry gradually declined. Alternative materials became more popular. Styles changed. Markets evolved. The shift did not occur overnight. But over time, it reduced demand for one of the fur trade's most important products. Economic systems rarely collapse because of a single cause. More often, multiple changes occur simultaneously. That was exactly what happened to the fur trade. Environmental pressures, changing markets, new industries, population growth, transportation innovations. Together, these developments altered the world that had sustained generations of voyagers. The transportation revolution proved especially significant. For centuries, rivers had served as the primary highways of the interior. Voyagers possessed skills perfectly suited to that reality. But the 19th century introduced new technologies. Steamboats appeared on many waterways. Railroads gradually expanded. Road networks improved. Each innovation reduced dependence on traditional canoe transportation. At first, these changes affected only certain regions. Large portions of the northern interior remained accessible primarily by water. Yet the direction of change was clear. Mechanical transportation offered advantages that human-powered systems could not easily match. A steamboat could move large quantities of cargo without relying entirely on paddles. A railroad could transport goods regardless of river conditions. The age of industrial transportation had begun. For voyagers, this transformation unfolded gradually. Many continued working for years. Some adapted to new roles within changing economies. Others remained connected to traditional transportation systems operating in remote regions. But the profession itself was losing the central importance it had once possessed. There would never again be a period when canoe brigades served as the primary transportation network for such a vast portion of North America. Yet it would be a mistake to view this period solely as decline. The voyagers had accomplished something extraordinary. For generations, they connected a continent. They transported goods across distances that continue to impress historians today. They helped support exploration, commerce, diplomacy, and communication. They carried the fur trade to regions that Europeans had once considered unreachable. Their labor made possible the growth of trading networks stretching thousands of miles. Even as economic conditions changed, the legacy of those achievements remained. The rivers they traveled still flowed. The portage trails they followed still crossed forests and hills. Many settlements that later became towns and cities had roots in the transportation routes of the fur trade. The voyagers left traces throughout the landscape. Place names preserved memories of their journeys. Historical records preserved evidence of their work. Communities preserved traditions connected to the era. By the middle decades of the 19th century, however, it was increasingly apparent that the world of the classic voyageur was fading. A new North America was emerging. Governments exercised greater control. Settlers arrived in larger numbers. Industry expanded. Technology accelerated change. The wilderness transportation network that had once dominated the continent no longer occupied the same position. Yet before we conclude the story of the voyagers, we must pause to consider something deeper than economics or transportation. We must consider how these men lived, what they left behind, and why their memory endured long after the fur trade itself began to fade into history. As the 19th century progressed, and the great age of the fur trade slowly receded into history, the voyagers began to occupy a curious place in public memory. Many of the men themselves disappeared from the historical record. They left behind few personal diaries. Many could not afford to preserve written accounts of their lives. Unlike governors, company directors, military officers, or famous explorers, most voyagers were ordinary working men. They spent their lives carrying cargo, paddling canoes, repairing equipment, and traveling across immense distances. History often remembers leaders more easily than laborers. Yet the voyagers proved difficult to forget. Part of the reason lies in the scale of what they accomplished. For more than 2 centuries, they helped operate one of the largest transportation systems in North American history. Before railroads crossed the continent, before highways linked distant regions, before telegraph wires connected settlements, voyagers carried goods, information, and people through an enormous network of waterways. Their achievements become even more impressive when viewed through the lens of geography. North America is vast. Distances that appear manageable on a modern map become far more daunting when imagined from the seat of a canoe. A journey that today might require a few hours by airplane could once consume months of labor. The voyagers completed such journeys repeatedly, year after year, generation after generation. The physical endurance required remains difficult to comprehend. Historians have attempted to estimate the workloads carried by voyageur crews. Although exact figures vary, surviving records consistently describe remarkable levels of effort. Long days on the water were normal. Portages demanded repeated lifting of heavy cargo. Food was often simple. Weather conditions were unpredictable. Yet the transportation network continued functioning because thousands of men performed these tasks with extraordinary consistency. The voyagers also contributed to the geographical understanding of North America. Many famous explorers relied upon their assistance. Alexander Mackenzie did not reach the Pacific alone. David Thompson did not map vast portions of the continent alone. Countless expeditions depended upon canoe crews capable of moving supplies through difficult environments. The names of explorers often appear prominently in history books. The voyagers frequently remain in the background. Yet without them, many celebrated journeys would have been impossible. Maps themselves tell part of the story. By the early 18th century, European knowledge of the continent's interior remained limited. By the middle of the 19th century, that knowledge had expanded dramatically. The transformation resulted from the combined efforts of indigenous guides, explorers, traders, interpreters, surveyors, and voyagers. Every route traveled added information. Every successful journey improved understanding. The waterways used by the voyagers became pathways through which geographical knowledge spread. Their contribution extended beyond exploration. The voyagers also helped create enduring cultural connections across large portions of North America. French language traditions moved westward through the fur trade. Indigenous knowledge moved eastward. Communities exchanged ideas, technologies, customs, and experiences. The resulting cultural landscape was complex and dynamic. The story of the voyagers therefore cannot be understood solely as a European story. Nor can it be understood solely as an indigenous story. It emerged from interaction, cooperation, adaptation, and sometimes conflict. The Métis communities that developed during the fur trade era represent one of the clearest examples of this process. Their history became deeply intertwined with the transportation networks operated by voyagers. Family connections linked distant regions. Languages blended influences from multiple traditions. Economic and social relationships crossed cultural boundaries. Many descendants of these communities continue to preserve and celebrate that heritage today. The voyagers also left an imprint upon place names across North America. Rivers, lakes, settlements, and transportation routes often reflect the history of the fur trade. Some names commemorate explorers. Others preserve indigenous terminology. Still others recall trading posts or important portages. Together, they form a historical landscape that remains visible even in the modern world. A traveler examining a map of Canada or the northern United States can still find echoes of the Voyageur era. The legacy survives not only in geography but also in folklore. Stories about voyagers circulated for generations. Some emphasized courage. Others highlighted endurance. Many focused on adventure. Songs became an especially important part of this tradition. During the fur trade era, singing helped establish rhythm during long hours of paddling. Afterward, those songs became cultural memories. Some were preserved through oral tradition. Others were written down by historians and collectors. Today they offer valuable glimpses into the emotional world of the men who spent their lives on the water. Not every story survived accurately. As often happens with historical memory, fact and legend sometimes became intertwined. Later generations occasionally romanticized the voyagers. Paintings depicted heroic canoe brigades crossing dramatic landscapes. Writers emphasized adventure and wilderness. Certain realities received less attention. The exhaustion, the injuries, the isolation, the economic uncertainties. The hardships were real. Yet so were the accomplishments. Understanding the voyagers requires balancing both perspectives. They were neither mythical heroes nor anonymous laborers without significance. They were skilled professionals operating within a demanding economic system. Their work connected regions that would otherwise have remained isolated. Their efforts helped shape the development of northern North America. Perhaps the most important aspect of their legacy lies in what they reveal about human adaptability. The voyagers thrived within an environment that presented constant challenges. They learned to navigate enormous distances without modern technology. They adapted to seasonal changes. They cooperated across cultural boundaries. They built transportation networks suited to the geography around them. Rather than attempting to impose European methods upon every landscape, they often adopted techniques better suited to local conditions. The birch bark canoe remains a powerful symbol of that adaptability. Lightweight, efficient, practical. It reflected knowledge accumulated over generations. The voyagers succeeded not because they conquered geography but because they learned how to work with it. In many ways, that lesson remains relevant today. Human success often depends less on domination than understanding, less on force than cooperation, less on imposing solutions than learning from experience. As the age of railroads and industrial transportation replaced the age of the canoe, the voyagers gradually faded from everyday life. Yet they never vanished completely. Their memory survived in communities, songs, maps, museums, and historical traditions. And perhaps most importantly, their story survived because it remains one of the most remarkable examples of how ordinary people helped connect an entire continent. As our journey through the world of the voyagers comes to an end, it is worth returning to where we began. Imagine once again a continent without highways, without railroads, without engines, without modern maps showing every river and lake in precise detail. Imagine standing on the shore of the St. Lawrence River in the early 18th century. Ahead lies a vast interior stretching thousands of miles toward distant mountains, northern forests, and unknown horizons. Somewhere beyond those horizons are trading posts, indigenous communities, hunting grounds, rivers, lakes, and portage trails. Between them exists a transportation system unlike any other in the world. And moving through that system are the voyageurs. For generations, they paddled into landscapes that seemed endless. They crossed lakes so large they resembled inland seas. They carried heavy cargo over rugged portages. They endured storms, insects, hunger, exhaustion, and isolation. They traveled distances that remain impressive even in the modern age. Yet most of them were not famous. Most were not wealthy. Most did not expect their names to appear in history books. They worked because the fur trade required transportation. They worked because their families needed income. They worked because opportunities existed along the waterways of a growing continent. And through that work, they became part of something much larger than themselves. The story of the voyageurs is, in many ways, a story about connection. Connection between rivers. Connection between regions. Connection between peoples. Connection between economies separated by oceans. A beaver trapped near a remote northern stream might eventually influence fashion in Europe. A message written in Montreal might reach a distant trading post months later. A canoe departing from Lake Superior could carry goods that linked communities thousands of miles apart. The voyageurs served as the physical link holding these connections together. Yet the story is also about cooperation. The fur trade did not succeed because of any single group acting alone. It depended upon indigenous knowledge accumulated over countless generations. It depended upon merchants willing to invest resources. It depended upon explorers seeking new routes. It depended upon Métis communities whose contributions shaped the trade in profound ways. And it depended upon voyageurs willing to perform the daily labor required to keep the system functioning. History sometimes encourages us to focus on individuals. A famous explorer. A company founder. A political leader. The voyageurs remind us that large historical developments often depend upon thousands of people whose names are rarely remembered. The fur trade expanded because ordinary workers carried cargo. Exploration succeeded because canoe crews moved supplies. Trading posts survived because transportation networks remained operational. Behind every major achievement stood countless acts of effort repeated day after day. This perspective helps us understand the true scale of what the voyageurs accomplished. For more than 2 centuries, they helped connect much of northern North America. They operated within one of the largest transportation systems of the pre-industrial world. They moved goods across distances that stretched from the Atlantic watershed to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Few transportation workers in history have covered such immense territories under such demanding conditions. Their world eventually changed. Fashion shifted. Markets evolved. Beaver hats declined in popularity. Railroads expanded. Roads improved. Industrial technologies transformed transportation. The canoe brigades that once dominated the waterways gradually became less important. The economic foundations of the fur trade weakened. The great companies adapted or declined. New industries emerged. New settlements appeared. A different North America took shape. Yet traces of the voyageur world never completely disappeared. Some of the rivers they traveled remain important transportation corridors. Many of the communities that grew around trading posts still exist. Historic portage routes can still be traced across the landscape. Museums preserve artifacts from the fur trade era. Traditional songs continue to be performed. Historical reenactments keep old skills alive. And descendants of the people who participated in the fur trade continue to preserve and share their heritage. Modern travelers who paddle portions of the old routes sometimes gain a glimpse of what the voyageurs experienced. A quiet lake at sunrise. A winding river disappearing into the forest. The effort required to carry a canoe over land. The feeling of distance from the modern world. Such experiences help explain why the Voyageurs continue to capture the imagination. Their story combines adventure and endurance, commerce and exploration, cooperation and conflict. It occupies a unique place in the history of North America. Perhaps there is also something timeless about their relationship with the landscape. The Voyageurs depended upon observation. They watched the weather. They studied currents. They learned the rhythms of rivers and seasons. Success required attention, patience, and respect for the environment. Those qualities remain valuable regardless of the century in which one lives. The waterways that shaped their lives still flow today. The forests still stand across large portions of the north. The lakes continue reflecting the sky just as they did centuries ago. Much has changed since the age of the fur trade. Yet the geography that guided the Voyageurs remains remarkably familiar. And so, as evening settles across the rivers and lakes of North America, we can picture the final canoe of the season moving quietly through calm water. The paddles rise and fall in steady rhythm. A distant shoreline grows darker beneath the fading light. The cargo has been delivered. The long journey is nearly complete. Ahead lies camp. Ahead lies rest. And behind stretches a continent connected, in no small measure, by the labor, endurance, and determination of the Voyageurs. Their names may be forgotten. Their routes may no longer carry the commerce of an empire. But their story remains. A story of rivers. A story of distance. A story of cooperation. And a story of the men who paddled across a continent. Long after the great fur trade companies reduced their canoe brigades, long after beaver hats faded from fashion, and long after railroads began crossing the continent, the memory of the Voyageurs continued to endure. History often remembers the people who arrive at the end of a process. Settlers who build towns. Politicians who create governments. Industrialists who construct railroads. Yet before many of those developments became possible, others had already traveled the routes, mapped the waterways, and connected distant regions. The Voyageurs belonged to that earlier generation. They helped create the pathways that later generations would follow. In many ways, they occupied a unique position in North American history. To understand why, it is helpful to compare them with some of the other frontier figures who emerged during the same broad era. In the United States, the westward movement of settlers eventually became associated with wagon trains traveling routes such as the Oregon Trail. Thousands of families crossed plains and mountains seeking farmland, opportunity, and new lives. Their journeys required endurance and courage. The scale of migration transformed the continent. Yet the objectives of those travelers differed from those of the Voyageurs. The Oregon Trail carried settlers. The Voyageur routes carried commerce. One movement focused primarily on permanent settlement. The other focused primarily on transportation and trade. The Voyageurs rarely traveled west in order to establish farms. Instead, they moved constantly between locations. Their lives were shaped by motion. Rivers became roads. Canoes became vehicles. Distance became a normal part of existence. Another group often associated with frontier history is the mountain men of the American West. These trappers and traders operated throughout the Rocky Mountains during the early 19th century. Like the Voyageurs, they spent long periods in remote regions. Like the Voyageurs, they depended heavily upon indigenous knowledge and trade relationships. And like the Voyageurs, their lives became surrounded by stories, legends, and romantic imagery. Yet important differences existed. Mountain men often worked individually or in small groups. Voyageurs usually operated within highly organized transportation networks. A mountain man might spend months trapping in relative isolation. A voyageur typically functioned as part of a crew whose success depended upon cooperation and coordination. The comparison highlights something distinctive about the Voyageur world. It was simultaneously adventurous and highly structured. The wilderness remained vast and unpredictable. Yet the transportation system itself operated according to schedules, supply chains, and established routes. The voyagers were not simply wanderers. They were professionals. Their work formed the backbone of a continental trade network. This distinction helps explain why their influence proved so significant. For generations, they carried not only goods but also information. News traveled through fur trade routes. Maps improved through repeated journeys. Knowledge moved from one region to another. The voyagers helped transform distant territories from unknown spaces into connected parts of a larger world. The influence of these connections can still be seen today. Many modern communities across Canada and portions of the northern United States owe part of their origins to the fur trade. Some began as trading posts. Others developed near transportation hubs or important portages. Over time, economic activities changed. Populations grew. Settlements expanded. Yet the historical routes often remained linked to the waterways once traveled by canoe brigades. The voyagers also left a lasting impact on how people understood the geography of North America. Maps created during the fur trade era provided foundations for future exploration and development. Government surveyors, settlers, and entrepreneurs frequently benefited from knowledge gathered by earlier generations of traders and travelers. Information accumulated gradually. Each journey added details. Each route increased understanding. The process resembled the construction of a vast puzzle assembled over many decades. The completed picture helped shape the future of the continent. In recent years, interest in the voyagers has experienced something of a revival. Historians continue studying the fur trade and the societies connected to it. Museums preserve artifacts from the era. Historical parks protect important locations. Educational programs introduce new audiences to the story. Canoe expeditions sometimes retrace portions of the old routes. Participants gain first-hand appreciation for the challenges faced by earlier travelers. Even short journeys can reveal the remarkable endurance required to move through the wilderness by paddle and portage. Many people discover that distances appearing modest on a map feel very different when crossed under human power. The experience encourages respect for those who completed such journeys repeatedly throughout their lives. The revival of interest also reflects a broader shift in historical understanding. Modern historians increasingly recognize that large historical developments involve many different groups of people. Explorers matter. Political leaders matter. Business owners matter. But workers matter as well. The voyagers remind us that history is not created only by those who issue orders. It is also created by those who carry them out. The fur trade depended upon labor. Without the voyagers, goods would not have moved. Without movement, the trade could not have functioned. Without the trade, much of the history of northern North America would have unfolded differently. This perspective gives the Voyageur story a surprisingly modern relevance. Today, vast transportation networks still connect continents. Cargo ships cross oceans. Trains carry freight across countries. Aircraft transport goods around the world. Modern economies remain dependent upon logistics. They remain dependent upon people who move products from one place to another. The technologies have changed. The principle remains familiar. Long before container ships and rail terminals, the voyagers performed a similar role using the tools available to them. Their highways were rivers. Their engines were muscles. Their cargo vehicles were canoes. Yet the essential challenge was the same. How do you connect distant places? How do you move goods efficiently? How do you build relationships across enormous distances? The voyagers spent generations answering those questions. And perhaps that is why their story continues to resonate. It is not merely a story about the past. It is a story about human ingenuity, about adaptation, about cooperation, and about the determination required to connect a world that often seemed impossibly large. As the waters of the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, the Great Lakes, the Saskatchewan, the Athabasca, and countless smaller rivers continue their journeys toward the sea, they pass through landscapes shaped by centuries of history. Hidden within that history are the memories of canoe brigades, distant portages, campfires along riverbanks, and the steady rhythm of paddles moving through the water. The voyageurs are gone. The fur trade empire has faded. But the rivers remain. And as long as those rivers flow, the story of the men who paddled across a continent will never be entirely forgotten.